Hi, everybody. We're going to continue
Hello.
our talk about preparation for the coming of the Messiah. And we're going to do that by looking at Luke chapter 1. So we're going to jump into Luke chapter 1. I hope that you will enjoy it and you'll learn a lot. Let's do it. Okay, so here we go with Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 23. That's what we're going to cover today. So just to review a little bit, the last time we mentioned that there's so many prophecies, more than 300 prophecies about Jesus that were fulfilled. Because last time we were trying to answer the question, why were the Jewish people looking forward to the coming of the Messiah? And all those prophecies is a big reason why they were doing that. And we talked about a couple of the prophecies of Daniel, if you remember that. Well, this time we're going to start out now in Luke itself, Luke chapter 1. And Karen, would you please read the first two verses for us?
Sure. Since many have tried to compose an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and servants of the word have handed them down to us.
Okay, good. So that's how Luke starts his gospel. And what's our question for this verse?
Had anyone tried writing about the life of Jesus before?
Yeah, does he mention something about that?
Says those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning have handed them down to us.
Well, what about the first part, though? Since many
have tried to write.
Compose. And when it uses the word compose, of course, that's assuming that it's a written account, right? So it says that many had tried writing about the life of Jesus before Luke started to do it. Okay, so that's an important piece of information for us. And what's the follow-up question?
Where did they get their information from?
Yeah, where'd they get their information from for these accounts?
From the eyewitnesses who had seen the things that had happened?
Right, like it says there, those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning have handed them down to us. And that is a word that has to do with, the oral transmission. They shared those things with them. All right, let's continue now. What's the next follow-up question?
What verb does he use to describe the things that had happened? So did you help me out on that one?
Yes.
Fulfilled.
Right, fulfilled. It says right there. Okay, but the point is, again, they're thinking of this in terms of prophecy. Jesus fulfilled prophecies. So these were not just things that happened, they were things that fulfilled prophecy, okay? And Luke has this in his mind when he begins writing his gospel. Okay, let's continue. Next verse, Luke chapter 1, verse 3.
It seemed good for me too, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in order, most excellent Theophilus.
Theophilus, that's right. Okay, and the question?
Does Luke sound like a careful researcher?
What do you think?
Oh, definitely, because it says having investigated everything carefully.
Right, so he's trying to do this as carefully as he can. And follow-up question?
How did he organize his gospel? Well, it says to write it out in order.
In order,
from the beginning.
Right? Okay, so this is where we see a difference between the gospel writers. Matthew, he liked to put all the teachings of Jesus in chunks. He liked to put the miracle stories together in a chunk. He liked doing it that way. Well, Luke is trying to put it in more of a chronological order. So this is, something that's unique about his gospel. Okay, next verse.
This is verse 4. So that you may know the exact truth of the things you have been taught.
Good. And what's the question?
What does this tell you about Theophilus, the one to whom this was written?
Yeah, what does this verse tell you?
That he had already been taught.
He had already been taught, right? So he'd already been taught some things. He was a believer. And Luke's going for more detail. So, this is something I think a lot of believers experience. You become a believer, you know a little something about it, but after a while you become curious. I would like to know more. I'd like to know more details. And that's exactly the need that Luke is responding to. This person was already a believer. They already knew about Jesus. He knew the basic story, but now Luke is going to fill in the details as best he can. Okay, so that again gives us a hint about Luke's motivation and what he's doing when he writes his gospel. Okay, next verse.
This is verse 5. And it happened in the days of Herod, king of Judea, that there was a certain priest named Zechariah of the division of Abia. Abia?
Abia, that's right.
And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth.
Okay, so we got a lot of names here. What's our question?
Who was Herod?
Yeah, who was Herod?
Well, he was king of the Jews, king of Judea.
Right, and king of Judea just essentially means king of the Jews at that time, because a large percentage of the Jews were living in Judea, although there were also many others scattered around the world in different places. But let's just try to get a little bit of information about this guy Herod, right? So Herod was Jewish by religion. He was, in terms of his religious beliefs, or at least what he claimed as his religion, was Jewish. But he was not Jewish by ancestry. He was Idumean. Now that's a New Testament name for what in the Old Testament we call Edomites. It's the same people, just, a different way of pronouncing their name, okay? So he's of that particular ethnic background. But he's Jewish by religion, but, okay, he built all these Roman temples everywhere. And when we talk about Roman temples, we're talking about Roman temples with idols that Herod built and he paid for. And here we're seeing a picture of just one area where he made some temples, or at least one of these temples anyway, which is at Caesarea Philippi, way up in the north. You can see that on the left in the reproduction drawing, there's a temple right in front of a cave, and that's the same cave that you can go up there and see today. And as you can see in the picture to the left, you can see the ruins of the various temples that were built here at that time, pagan temples. These were not Jewish temples. These were pagan, Greek-style, Roman-style temples, complete with idols. So what is he doing? He's Jewish. Why is he doing this kind of thing? And this is not an isolated instance. He had a much bigger temple at Caesarea on the Sea, or some people call it Caesarea Maritima, which means the same thing. It's right there on the sea, and you can see the aerial photograph there of the excavation area of Caesarea. It's, like the biggest archaeological excavation in Israel, I believe it is now. And a lot of tourists go there and see it. And right in the center, near the harbor, up on the top of a platform that was built, you can see in the picture on the left side, he built a huge temple with a huge, actually a statue of Augustus, the Roman emperor, shown as a god inside of this temple. So he's Jewish, but what is he doing? Why is he doing that? And yes, he was Jewish by religion, but because he was Edomite, and probably also because of his way of running the government, he was not very much loved by his Jewish subjects. And so this is probably part of the motivation that he built all these desert fortresses out in the Judean desert. And we're looking at the ruins of one of them and a reconstruction of one of them called the Herodian. And this is actually the one where he ended up being buried after he died. And so we have a big account of that in Josephus, the Jewish historian, who gives us all the details. But anyway, he built all these things out in the desert because he was always afraid that his own Jewish subject would rise up against him and revolt against him. And he was prepared. So he had a series of fortresses to protect himself all over the place. So he was Jewish, but, not Jewish by birth. Okay. So we got the blue arrow there, so that means we're going back to a verse that we already looked at. So Karen, you want to read the question at the bottom?
Who are the daughters of Aaron?
All right. Any idea about that? It says that
descendants?
Elizabeth, or Elisheva, as we call her name in Hebrew, that she was from the daughters of Aaron. So what do you think that means?
A descendant from the brother of Moses, Aaron.
Right, descended from the brother of Aaron, brother of Moses, who is Aaron, and that means she's of priestly descent, right? So her family are priests and have been priests, going all the way back to Aaron. Okay, good. And you see there's a little follow-up question there?
And the priestly divisions?
Yeah, the priestly divisions, what were those?
Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the priestly divisions they date back at least to the time of David, when he divided the priests into 24 divisions. And then they would come and they would serve each according to his division. So we know that Zechariah was in, it said in the verse that we just read, he was in the division of Abiah. And as you can see on the chart there, this was the 8th division. It's mentioned there in 1 Chronicles 24. So each one of these divisions would serve at a certain time in the temple in Jerusalem. And basically what they did is they split up the weeks of the year between the divisions. And each division would have 2 weeks when they would serve. One at one time of year and the other 6 months later, basically. And then all the priests would serve together during the important festivals during the year. So we actually know which priestly division Zechariah was in, and we know even more about that. We know when his division served. Okay, so as it says there on the slide, his division, the division of Abiah, served the last week of Iyar, that's the Jewish month of Iyar, which is about mid-April to mid-May, and they also served the last week of Mar Heshvan, so that would be the opposite time of year, in mid-October to mid-November. So the event that we're talking about, we can actually place it in time into one of these 2 periods in the year. We know that much about it. And of course, different people have different opinions about which one of the 2, but it might well be in the one in the spring. Okay, so let's continue. All right, next verse.
This is from Luke 1, verse 6. And they were both righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements of the Lord.
Okay, good. So we're talking still about Zechariah and his wife Elisheva, or Elizabeth. And what's our question?
Does this mean it was possible for people to be righteous according to the law of Moses?
Right. You know, this is a big topic of conversation, right? Some preachers like to say it was impossible to live according to the law of Moses. I've heard that many, many times. But what does this verse actually say about Zechariah and Elisheva?
It says that they were doing it blamelessly.
Blamelessly. They were obeying all the commandments and requirements of the Lord correctly, according to God's instructions. So, does this mean it was possible for people to be righteous according to the law?
It looks like yes,
it sure looks like that. Well, we don't want to base any doctrine on just one verse. So let's look at somebody else in the biblical record, and that's Paul. And this is what he wrote in Philippians chapter 3, verse 6. I was, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to the righteousness which is in the law, found, and here he used that same word, blameless. So he's talking about before he became a believer in Jesus, in Yeshua, he was blameless. He was obeying the law correctly. Okay, so what do you think? Does this reinforce our idea that it was possible to be righteous according to the law of Moses?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Tacks it down pretty well. So what about the follow-up question here?
Did this bring salvation?
Okay, this is the big question, right? Yes, people could live blamelessly according to the law. Zechariah did it, Elisheva did it, Paul did it, but did this bring salvation?
No.
No, it doesn't bring salvation. It meant you were obedient to God in your calling as a Jewish person, but it didn't get you saved, because otherwise Paul would have been saved before he met Jesus, and the others would have been saved before they knew about Jesus. Or just like Jewish people today, who some of them are raised in a religious environment, they obey the law, but they're still not saved until they encounter Jesus and accept Yeshua into their hearts. Okay. So yeah, it was possible. This is, actually an incorrect teaching that you hear sometimes, where people say it was impossible to obey the. No, it was possible to obey the law, but the problem was it did not bring salvation, didn't save you. It's a good thing to do, but it didn't save you. Okay, so let's continue.
Verse 7. And they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both advanced in years.
Okay, good. So, and our question?
Was this a problem for Elizabeth? Yes, because having children was very important in that time.
Right, exactly right. And we have a follow-up verse, jumping just a little bit ahead in Luke, where she says, "This is what the Lord has done for me in the days in which he looked to take away my disgrace among men." So she's referring back here to before she was able to get pregnant. So this was a disgrace, within the Jewish society of that time. And of course, hey, she's a lady who was really obedient to all the commandments of the Lord. That didn't just happen. You had to really work at it. And even though she was being obedient to God, she was not able to get pregnant. That made her look like something was wrong in her relationship to God, or at least that's how a lot of people would have understood it at that time. And so it was her disgrace. And so, yeah, this was a really big problem for her in her life. Okay, so let's go back to where we are in Luke, and let's read the next verse. Luke chapter 1, verse 8.
Now it came about, while he was performing his priestly service before God in the appointed order of his division.
Okay, and that little arrow tells us we're going to continue right on to the next verse.
According to the custom of the priesthood, that he was chosen by the lot that was for the burning of incense to enter into the sanctuary of the Lord.
Okay, good. And what's the question?
What was this lot?
Yeah, what was this lot, right? Well, lot, of course, means that you're, it's like tossing dice or something to choose somebody. And the way that they did it in the temple in those days was a group of priests that wanted to serve that day and were available, ready to serve, would get together early in the morning, and the chief, the guy who was in charge of designating jobs that day, he would think of a number, and all the priests present would hold up a finger, and he'd go keep counting the fingers until he came to that number, right? So it's just a way of, randomizing who would get the job of doing that. So this lot was done, and the way that it worked out was that usually this job of burning the incense was just one of the jobs assigned for that day. But because there were so many priests and the different divisions coming in and out, at different times, it was quite usually just a once in a lifetime that somebody would serve the incense, burning the incense in the sanctuary. Usually a once in a lifetime experience. And so this was a really important moment because this was considered the holiest thing that an ordinary priest could do in his life, was to offer this incense inside the sanctuary of the Lord. Okay, so this was a big deal. And this was not a common thing to him. It wasn't something he did every day. So I imagine as a priest, and he's already an elderly man, he would have, looked forward to this with a little bit of, concern, want to make sure you do it right. It's a really important thing to do. So here's our follow-up question.
Where was the sanctuary?
Where was the sanctuary? So in our background image here, you can see there's a picture of the big courtyard of the temple. And inside that bigger courtyard, there's a smaller courtyard. And inside that smaller courtyard, there's this building standing up with the little gold pointy things on the top. Well, that building that rises up above the others, that's the sanctuary building. Sanctuary just means holy place. And it's also referred to as the holy place. So where he was going to offer that incense was inside of that building in the center of the huge temple grounds. Now, if we're trying to figure out where that was today, if we go to Jerusalem, the Temple Mount can still be identified. The walls of the temple are still there with the same stones from the time of Jesus. And this is what we call the Temple Mount, Har Habayit in Hebrew. And it's kind of circled there with the yellowish circle. And over on the right, we have a diagram of what it looked like in the time of Jesus. So this whole big area was the temple, but in the middle, you see there's that inner courtyard, and then in the left side of that inner courtyard, there is a building, a grayish building outlined with black. That's the sanctuary building. So that's where it was actually located. And here we have a close-up of that inner area, the inner courts of the temple, and you can see the sanctuary building there. So that's the holy place. And in the back of it, in the white, there's a square area. That would be the Holy of Holies in the back of that same building. Now, Zechariah was not the high priest, so he could not go into the Holy of Holies, but he was going to go into that holy place in order to offer up the incense. And if you remember, there was a couple of very important things in that holy place. We got the lampstand, the menorah, the 7-branched candlestick. Of course, they didn't have candles at that time. It was oil lamps at the top of each of the branches of the lampstand. There was the table of showbread, and that's also called the bread of the presence. Bread offered up in the presence of God there. And then we also have the altar of incense. And so, each priest, you would be assigned to one of these different things to take care of, trim the lamps or change the bread and so forth. But on this day, Zechariah got the job of going in and offering up the altar on the altar of incense. Okay, so let's continue to the next verse.
And all the crowd of the people was praying outside at the hour of the incense offering.
Okay, good. So you can see the background picture there. There's a white arrow pointing down to a courtyard right in front of the courtyard that holds the sanctuary building. And that arrow, that courtyard that the arrow is pointing to, this is known as the courtyard of the women, because the women were ordinarily not allowed to go any further in, although they did for certain occasions. And that courtyard of the women is where most of the actual worship, in terms of the worshipers, took place. The men and women both in that area. This is where they would worship facing the sanctuary, right? And this would happen a couple of times a day on an ordinary day. People would gather in that area at the hour of the incense offering, okay? So what's our question there? Did we read it already?
What was the hour of the incense offering?
What was the hour of the incense offering?
I bet you have an exact answer for that.
Yes, we do. Okay, it was the time, it was done at the time of the morning sacrifice and the afternoon sacrifice. And you might remember that this was done every day. It's called the daily or perpetual sacrifice. So every morning and every afternoon, it's called sometimes the evening sacrifice, but it actually happened in Jesus' day around 3 p.m. So the morning and the afternoon sacrifice every day would be an animal offered up as a sacrifice. And this would be done before the incense was burned, right? So the animals offered. And so this is the morning sacrifice. There was also a noon prayer, and that's because during the festival days, certain festival days, there would be additional offerings besides the regular morning sacrifice and afternoon sacrifice. And those additional offerings, many of them would be offered up during this noon time. So they turned this into 3 times of prayer. And that actually turned out to be the earliest times of prayer of the very earliest Christians after the time of Jesus' resurrection. So it actually came over into Christian culture for a while too, until they added more prayers, prayer at dawn, prayer just before going to bed, and the number of prayers grew after that. But originally it was just like the Jewish people were practicing in the time of Jesus, the 3 daily prayers. And it's mentioned in Acts chapter 3, one of the prayers. Would you read that for us, Karen?
Peter and John were going up to the temple at the 9th hour, 3 p.m., the hour of prayer.
Right, so the 9th hour, according to the way they counted the hours there, at that time starting at 6 a.m., the 9th hour would be 3 p.m. And so this is when Peter and John were going up to the temple for the afternoon sacrifice. Remember when they healed the man. Very nice story there preserved for us in the book of Acts. Okay, so let's get back to our story. So Luke chapter 1, verse 11. Would you read that for us?
And a messenger of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the altar of incense.
Okay, so now remember, he's a little bit nervous going in here anyway, because it's probably the first time he ever did it. And even if it wasn't, it would only have been his second or third time at the most. And, so you're really concentrating on doing everything right. You don't want to mess up. And suddenly, somebody shows up in there. So what's our question?
What is a messenger of the Lord?
Okay, so I've translated this literally, what it says in the original language, as a messenger of the Lord. So what is a messenger of the Lord?
A messenger is angel.
Right. It's what today we call angel. Okay. So this is an angel that appears before him. Because in the Bible, when they appear on earth, they usually don't have wings. So sorry about the wings in the picture here. It's the only one I could find. So just erase those wings in your mind, because the only time we see the angels with wings is in a vision when they're in heaven, something like that. But when they appeared on earth, usually we don't hear anything about the wings. So go ahead and read the next verse.
And when he saw him, Zechariah was terrified, and fear fell upon him.
Okay, so he did not have just a happy reaction to this. He had a strong negative reaction. So our question is?
Why was Zechariah afraid?
Yeah, why was he afraid? It's an angel appearing to him, right? Aren't angels supposed to make us happy and feel good?
And because angels are scary.
Certainly in the Bible, at least. Every time anybody sees an angel in the Bible, they are petrified. They are very frightened. Okay, so quite different than our image of little fat baby cute angels or beautiful lady angels. No, it wasn't like that. In the Bible, when people saw an angel, they were terrified. Why? Well, because you're coming into the real presence of God. Not just like when you're thinking of God as great. It's when God shows up, that has an impact on you, an impact on your life. And he immediately responded. He was terrified. Okay? Even though he's a righteous man, living godly before the Lord, he was terrified when he came into the presence of God. And of course, this is something we should really think about. In the days when everything is kind of happy, happy, lovey, you know, that's not the way it is in the Bible. The Bible says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Why does it say that? Well, obviously it's very important to understand the power, the awesome, raw power of God. It's something that makes you tremble when you come into the real presence of God, not just thinking about it, but when it actually happens, okay? So this is important to think about. Anyway, let's go on. Next verse.
But the messenger said to him, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will give him the name John."
Right, okay, so question?
What is this name in the original Hebrew?
Right, because in Greek it's Ioannis, but we're thinking about when this was actually happening, of course, they would have been speaking Hebrew, and the name John in Hebrew is Yochanan. Yochanan means grace of God. So the Yo part is a hint to the name of God, and the Hanan is the grace. So Yochanan, the grace of God. Beautiful name that the angel says is supposed to be given to John. Continue.
And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth.
Okay, there's our arrow, so we're going to jump ahead to the next verse.
For he will be great in the sight of the Lord, and he will drink no wine or liquor, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit while yet in his mother's womb.
Okay, good. And the question?
Why would John drink no alcohol?
Yeah, what do you think is the big deal here with the alcohol, right?
It has to do with a vow.
The vow. What vow is that?
The Nazarite vow.
Okay, so you know what we're talking about, right? The Nazarite vow. Back in those days when somebody would say, "I'm not going to drink wine," or something like that, it was just immediately assumed that you were making a Nazarite vow, and the rabbis talked about this in great detail. So what exactly is the Nazarite vow? Well, we read about it in Numbers chapter 6. This is the way that somebody could make this special vow and set themselves apart to God for a period of time. And if you didn't specify the amount of time, then it was usually assumed that this would be 30 days, right? So a month long, setting yourself aside to God. And as part of that vow, you wouldn't drink alcohol. Now that would be like the priests. When the priests were actually on duty in the temple, they were not allowed to, drink any alcohol so that they wouldn't mess up what they're doing. So it was a little bit similar to being in the category of a priest for a short time. You also wouldn't cut your hair. And so that's why, if you remember, Samson was a lifelong Nazarite. And there's all the story about him cutting his hair. And that's all connected to him being a Nazarite with a Nazarite vow. Another thing you were not allowed to do during the whole time of your Nazarite vow was that you were not allowed to touch the dead. No direct contact with the dead. Okay, so this is clearly setting aside John the Baptist as a Nazarite. Now, unlike the normal Nazarite vow, he, just like Samson, would be a Nazarite for life. So this is something quite unusual in Jewish history. Very few people were in this category, okay, along with the prophet Samuel. Okay, so we got the blue arrow. We're going back to that same verse, Luke chapter 1, verse 15. And a follow-up question. What's the follow-up question?
When would John's special calling begin?
Right, when would his special calling as a Nazarite begin?
When he's still in his mother's womb.
Right, it says he's going to be filled with the Holy Spirit while yet in his mother's womb. His ministry, his calling, I guess his calling more than his ministry, but his calling would begin while he's still in his mother's womb. So this is amazing. All right, let's continue.
And he will turn back many of the sons of Israel to the Lord their God.
Okay, so here we want to focus on this turn back many, because this means in Hebrew shuv, it means to turn back, and it also has the meaning repent, turn back to God, repent to God. So John's ministry is going to lead many people to repent and turn back to the Lord their God. All right, good. Next verse.
This is verse 17. And he himself will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children, and the disobedient to the thinking of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord.
Okay, good. So he's quoting here from a prophecy in the Bible. What prophecy is this? Well, I already told you, Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. God is speaking, "Look, I am sending to you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and fearful day of the Lord. And he will turn back the heart of the fathers to their sons, and the heart of the sons to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with destruction." And so I've marked the sections that are being referred to there in the gold print. So what's our follow-up question?
When would this happen?
Yeah, when does it say this is going to happen?
Before the coming of the great and fearful day of the Lord.
Before the great and fearful day of the Lord, before the day of judgment. Very important. God's going to do something before that end time event. Okay, so blue arrow, so we're going back to verse 17, and we've got a new question.
Who will John go before? So we know that that's Jesus, right?
We know that at that time, if we look in the verse before, if I go back to verse 16, remember the angel says that John is going to turn back many of the sons of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him. So John is going to go before the Lord their God, before God. Now, knowing that this is related to Jesus, this is a direct prophecy about Jesus being God. So just amazing how this is all right there, right from the very beginning. Okay, let's go on. Verse 18.
And Zechariah said to the messenger, "How will I know this is true? For I'm an old man, and my wife is advanced in her days."
Okay, so they're elderly people. Okay, and the question?
Does this prophecy of the messenger remind you of anything in the Bible? And I would say yes. It reminds me very much of Abraham, because he
Right.
and Sarah were both old when Isaac was promised to them.
Right, exactly right. And so here we have a reference back to Genesis 17. And Abraham said in his heart when he heard that his wife is going to have a child, even though she's very old, "Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" That's definitely a miracle, right? I think we can all agree that's a miracle. But it's really, really similar to what's going on with John the Baptist. You know, they're both elderly. Zechariah and Elizabeth, they're both elderly, and yet they're going to have a child. So it's a very similar situation. Okay, let's go to verse 19.
And the messenger answered and said to him, "I am Gabriel, the one standing before God, and I have been sent to speak to you and tell you the good news about these things."
So let's talk about this. We've got an angel, an angelic messenger, whose name is actually given. That doesn't always happen. And the name is Gabriel. So what's our question?
What does Gabriel mean?
Okay, well, it's right there on the slide. Gabriel, or Gavriel, means the mighty one of God. So L at the end is God. Gaver, it means a mighty one. So Gavriel, mighty one of God. Okay. And our follow-up question?
Why does he stand before God?
Yeah, what does that mean? It says the one standing before God. Well, this doesn't just mean, you know, he shows up there accidentally or something. I mean, this is an indication of his high position. He is appointed, he is stationed before God. So in other words, he's in a very exalted position. So those standing before God, these were the highest angels. And in Jewish tradition, also Christian tradition, these are the archangels. In the book of Daniel, they're called princes, angelic princes, sarim. And the fact that they're standing, that means they are standing as servants ready to do God's will. This was considered an appropriate position for a servant, so that they're ready to do whatever the master says immediately. Okay, good. So let's go to the next verse.
This is verse 20. And look, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day when these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their proper time.
Okay, good. And what's our question?
Why will Zechariah be punished? Because he didn't believe the angel's words.
He didn't believe, right? God expected him to accept it, to believe it. But he had some hesitation there, and so he's going to get a little punishment here. Oh, that's interesting to think about. Will God actually do that when we don't have faith? Well, that's what happened to Zechariah. Very important to have faith. Okay, and the next verse?
And the people were waiting for Zechariah and were wondering at his delay in the temple.
Good, okay. And what's our question?
Why were they waiting for Zechariah?
Yeah, why are they waiting?
Because he's going to come out of the temple.
Right. He's inside the temple. He's doing this offering of the incense, which was considered the holiest moment in the whole ritual, in the time of prayer. And while he was in there, the people were outside, usually bowed down in silent prayer for about 20 minutes, half an hour. And when he came out, then he would stand on the stairs right in front of the sanctuary building, and from here he would bless the people who were out in the court of the women. That's that cross-shaped court over to the right. So they were expecting, the prayer was done. They're waiting for the blessing, because he would stand on those steps and direct a blessing at the people out in the court of the women. So here we get a little bit of a close-up of a model, and you can see the white arrow is pointing to the stairs where he would stand, and then down in the bottom right corner, that's the court of the women, where most of the people would be located when he came out to give the blessing. And we've even got a little picture of the priest giving the blessing. You see he's holding his hands in a kind of a funny way. This was the gesture, and still is today, the gesture that the priests will use when they're giving the priestly blessing, which by the way still happens, on important occasions in Jerusalem or even in the synagogue. And what is the blessing that they are saying? Well, it's right there from Numbers chapter 6, verse 24. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his face and give you peace. Okay? So this is the blessing. So they're waiting for the blessing. He comes out, and what happens? Nothing. He can't talk. Okay? And everybody knows it. Why? Because they're waiting for the blessing. So let's read about that in verse 22.
And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple. And he kept making signs to them and remained mute.
Right. And our question?
How did they know something had happened?
Yeah, how did they know that something had happened in the temple?
Because he couldn't speak.
Right, he couldn't speak, and he's up there moving his hands around trying to explain, but he couldn't speak. So immediately the whole crowd of people, not just the people near him, everybody that was there that day, which could have been hundreds and hundreds of people, knew that something had happened. It was not a secret. It was something everybody knew about. Okay, good. And then our last verse here.
This is verse 23.
Mm-hmm.
And it came about, when the days of his priestly service were ended, that he went back home.
Okay, so all finished, and he went home. So what's the question?
How long had he been serving in the temple? So before you said 1 week.
Right, so he would have finished his week of service, right? And then he went back to this cute little village of Ein Kerem. We believe that's where it was located anyway. That's the traditional location. It's just on the outskirts of Jerusalem, just a little beautiful valley with the hometown of Ein Kerem sitting there. Okay, good. So that finishes up our study for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something. We're going to continue pressing on in the book of Luke in our next episode. So I hope that you'll join us for that. Very nice for you to join us today, and we hope we'll see you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.